thank you so much. Welcome, everyone. I'm Manny RinconCruz, as we just said. I'm here in a dual capacity. I'm the founder of Poolside. We are a liquidity clearinghouse protocol for yield-bearing assets. We help you get integrated across DeFi by offering kind of quick unstaking for liquidations. But I'm actually trained as a financial historian. So I'm also the co-founder, along with Neil Ferguson, the financial historian of Four Winds. So check us out if you're interested. So I've been told that I'm here to provide a bit of a counterweight to the RWAs, or the future narrative. So I'm here to talk about liquid staking. And this talk is very brief. It comes in two parts. The first part is the history of government debt, and then the second part is the history of liquid staking. So this is kind of the tagline: is the future of crypto is native yield. And so we'll return to that at the end. This basically shows the share of all LSTs as a share of all DeFi TVL from 0.01% in 2021 to over 60% now, which is quite an amazing rise. Just a quick recap here. When I'm talking about crypto treasuries, I really mean something that's yield-bearing with very deep liquidity and a huge market cap. The reason that this matters is this allows it to serve as collateral for other financial institutions, and the native yield allows you to build very interesting new financial intermediaries or protocols on top. This is basically the talk, summarized in a meme. I will begin, in fact, with 1845, but I've been told that this is not Tucker Carlson, so I don't have 40 minutes, I have 15. So I will try to summarize this much faster for you, beginning with the history of government debt. Right, so there's a lot we can talk about here. I did a PhD in this, so it takes forever. But I wanted to talk about four main things, right? Four important pieces of the development of government debt as kind of this massive, fundamental financial piece of today's financial system. The first date is 1688. It's for credible commitments. We then move on to the creation of exchanges. Then we move on to the creation of stable yield. And then lastly, financial proliferation, which is what we all love and know. This is the most text I'll show you. Credible commitments here really refers to an innovation that began in the UK, in Great Britain. Up until that point, most governments had been funded through kind of expropriation and extraction. You would confiscate land or gold from people. The loans that were, in fact, extended to kings in Europe and other places were highly coercive. You would kind of get a wink that you had to lend the king or something else would happen. And you often did not get repaid, or you got repaid back in a whole bunch of other stuff that you originally had not lent out. The importance of 1688 and the Glorious Revolution is that this creates a constitutional order in Britain that secures property rights. We'll come back to this much later, but it's very important, right? You now have the ability to issue debt, to borrow, and for other people to know that you will, in fact, pay back. So the risk-free rate up until this point in time had been private debt. It had not been government debt. It's only with the innovation of kind of this structure where you separate kind of the judicial, legislative, and executive powers that people begin to trust government debt as kind of this safe asset, right, that will be, in fact, paid back in the future. The next important piece here is the creation of exchanges. This happens in two great financial bubbles that you might all already know about. It happens around the 1720s. The first one is the Mississippi Company stock bubble in France, triggered by John Law, who was the Minister of Finance, basically, to the king. And if you've ever thought about shitcoin and where that word might have been first coined, this is a very famous print, but you can actually see people defecating. This is called the sale of stock. Basically, it was considered, it's the first shitcoin. It's actually Mississippi Company stock. So it's a very old term. The South Sea bubble happens at exactly the same time. It's kind of instigated by John Law's friend, the Lord Londonderry in the UK. This is a very famous graph that I also really like. You can be one of the smartest men in the history in history, really, and you can still get wrecked by the market if you don't know when to, if you buy the top because you're aping in with your friends. So, this is also another story of stock that goes up during a massive bubble and then it goes down. And so what's important here is really the places that embrace financial innovation and the ones that shut it down. So the French basically ban all financial markets after the 1720s. The British, in theory, do too. They passed something called the Bubble Act. And so there's only 2 companies that get a royal charter to issue stock after the 1720s. But the reality is that they leave the financial markets open. And there's hundreds of companies that then issue unregistered securities that then trade for 100 years in these markets. So you start developing kind of this deep expertise for creating markets, pricing them, all these other things. So a lot of practices get developed in London at around over this 100 years. I promise this will all tie in together. So you have these markets, right, that are technically not supposed to be used for a lot of things, but the government is starting to experiment different ways of getting funding, right? So they tried different bond designs. So they tried lottery bonds and a few other things. The one that ends up succeeding is called a CONSOL, which stands for Consolidated Annuity. It's a perpetual instrument. You can hold it as long as the government doesn't buy it back from you, and it will give you 3% per year, and that's it. They're all fungible. They all yield 3%. If that sounds familiar, it's on purpose. I think it rhymes very beautifully with Ethereum today. So these were first invented in 1751, but they really only come into play during the wars against Napoleon. So there's a very famous article called A Tale of Two Currencies by Michael Bordeaux. You should check it out. It basically tries to explain the difference between British finance and French finance. So the way that Napoleon, if you've seen the movie recently, they might not discuss this, but the way that Napoleon financed his wars was basically through taxation. He had to run a balanced budget because nobody would buy French debt. Nobody wanted that stuff because he would pay you back in paper that was worth nothing. The British, on the other hand, had now this history of credible commitments for this 3% yielding thing, right? So they were able to issue massive amounts of it, right? Money from all over Europe, right? Dispossessed princes and kings, send all their funds to London to buy these safe assets. And as you can see here, the Brits are able to run these massive budget deficits that nobody else is able to do. And so they use these deficits to obviously finance their own navies, but also to subsidize the allies on the continent who are actually also dying fighting Napoleon. So they're basically subsidizing the rest of Europe for decades at a time. And what happens after the end of the Napoleonic Wars is really this blossoming of financial activity, because now you have a huge stock of these 3% yielding things. And what do you do with them? So that's when they become collateral for a new class of entities that we're all very familiar with, banks, as well as insurance companies and a host of other financial institutions. And it's that native yield, at least in sterling, right, where you hold it, you can now finance the operations of that institution, but you can then collateralize other types of risk-taking and other types of liquidity. So these become very important to the functioning of London's financial markets, and then obviously for the financing of commercial activity all throughout Europe. So that's enough history. So let's go to the history of the future, right? So we also begin with codes, credible commitments, right? Blockchains and smart contracts. I don't think I need to talk about that too much. We have permissionless exchanges, right? Beginning 2017, then Uniswap in 2020, and kind of there's AMMs now everywhere. And then obviously the big moment, I think, in my mind, happened around 2021 when you start actually getting on-chain native yield, right? This is when you get your steady 3%. And then obviously the last piece hasn't happened yet, but that's kind of what I'm trying to say will happen afterwards. So there's a bunch of different types of yield-bearing assets on chain. You have real-world assets, which everyone just talked about, liquid staking. You do have 2 other classes that get overlooked. You have collateral lending tokens, so kind of your RAP-C tokens or A tokens from Comp and Aave. And you have obviously rebasing assets and currencies, but we don't talk about those much. They're now a bigger share of DeFi, TVL. But if we zoom in, you can see that the lion's share of growth in yield-bearing assets is liquid staking. Real-world assets are that kind of medium light green thing right there. It's almost insignificant. Rebasing commodities are almost insignificant too. Your collateral lending position tokens were massive in the last bull run, right? That's where people were getting leverage. They're a lot smaller today, but really it's liquid staking that's driving most of the yield that goes on chain. So this took a long time to do. We did it with a team. So it's not up to date just because we ran out of man hours to do it before this presentation. So again, the future of crypto is native yield. So if you just look at the share of LSTs, basically divide LST by DeFi TVL, you get this massive number, right? It's now 60%. It's the largest share of all DeFi asset classes. So if we look at what the future of finance is, I don't really think it's going to be real world assets. I really do think it's going to be liquid staking. But there's a couple other reasons that RWAs, I think, don't quite fit the definition of what you would want as your safe asset collateralizing the rest of the financial system. The first one is that it's not as credible as code, right? Code, the beauty of this is that you don't need a constitution, right? In some ways, blockchains are constitutions inscribed in mathematics. RWAs bring back all this kind of the confusion and intricacies of the legal code and kind of legal entities and what you do with regulators. So it kind of weakens that piece of the chain. And then I think the other thing that really matters, which is kind of counterintuitive, is that the massive off-chain liquidity for things like Treasuries makes it really hard to then build on-chain liquidity. So then it doesn't quite play the same role that something like an LST will do. And so this is kind of counterintuitive. That doesn't mean that RWAs are not valuable. It just means that I think they're just so anchored in the traditional financial system that it's quite hard to move all that on-chain. And yeah, so again, I think that about wraps it up. I just wanted to provide a historical perspective on the future of finance, future of money. I wanted to say, I think that massive inflows happen in that kind of that yellow box. That coincides with the Napoleonic Wars and the traditional piece. That's where all the money kind of comes into the system. So I would expect LSTs and LRTs to get a lot larger before we then see a lot more new protocols built on top of them. So that's about it. So thank you so much for your time. And I look forward to meeting you in person.
Thanks, Manny.
Thank you, Manny. That wraps up our DeFi programming, and we're going to